For our first story, we go to Boise, Idaho, March 9th, 2012. Anna had always been a skeptic when it came to the paranormal, but on this night, something would challenge everything she believed. Growing up in a small town just outside Boise, Idaho, she had heard all the ghost stories. Abandoned houses where lights flickered with no power, forest trails where people claimed to hear voices whispering their names. But none of it ever truly scared her. That changed the night she woke up to find someone standing at the foot of her bed. It had been a normal Friday evening. Anna, a college student at Boise State, had come home for the weekend to visit her parents. Her childhood bedroom was exactly as she had left it. Old band posters on the walls, stuffed animals shoved into the corner, the same floral curtains fluttering softly against the open window. She remembered feeling exhausted that night, too tired to even change into pajamas before collapsing into bed. The next thing she knew, she was awake. At first, she wasn't sure what had stirred her. The room was quiet, the air still, except for the occasional rustle of the trees outside. Then she noticed something off. The room felt wrong, heavy. She couldn't explain it, but something about the air itself had changed. That was when she saw it, a dark silhouette standing motionless at the foot of her bed. She froze. Her mind scrambled for an explanation. Maybe her dad had come in to check on her. But as her eyes adjusted to the darkness, she realized two things. First, that the figure was too tall to be her father, and second, whoever it was had no face, just darkness, an empty void where features should have been. Panic surged through her. She opened her mouth to scream, but no sound came out. She tried to move, to bolt out of bed, but her body refused to listen. The figure stood there, silent, unmoving, just watching. Then it took a step forward. The moment its foot touched the floor, the air rushed out of the room as if something had sucked the atmosphere away. The curtains stopped moving. The sounds of the night outside vanished. Even her own breathing felt muffled, as if she were underwater. The thing took another step. Anna's chest tightened. Every fiber of her being screamed at her to run, to fight, to do something, but all she could do was stare, trapped in her own body. Then the shadow lunged. It didn't walk, didn't crawl. It glided toward her in an instant, closing the gap between them in the blink of an eye. And then Anna woke up, gasping, sweating, heart pounding so hard she thought it would burst. She sat up so fast she nearly toppled out of bed. The room was exactly as it had been before. Window open, curtains fluttering, the faint hum of crickets outside. For a long moment she sat there, struggling to catch her breath. A dream. It had to be a dream. Sleep paralysis, a trick of the mind. That was the only logical explanation. But just as her racing heart began to slow, she noticed something. Her bedroom door. It was open. She knew for a fact she had shut it before going to bed. Slowly, she swung her legs over the side of the bed, standing on shaky legs. The hallway beyond was dark, empty, but something felt off. The silence was different, too deep, as if the entire house was holding its breath. Forcing herself to move, she stepped out into the hall. The hardwood floor was ice-cold beneath her feet. The house was still, too still. As she reached the living room, the feeling in her stomach twisted into something worse than fear. The front door was unlocked. She stared at it, her mind racing. She had locked it, she was sure of it. Her parents were asleep upstairs, and they never left the door open at night. Hands shaking, she quickly turned the deadbolt, securing the door. The moment the lock clicked, a sudden thud echoed through the house from her bedroom. A deep, heavy sound, like something large hitting the floor. Anna turned, her breath catching in her throat. Every instinct screamed at her to run, but she had to know. She forced her feet forward, step by slow step, until she was standing just outside her bedroom door. The room was dark, empty, but something was different. The closet door, it was open, not wide open, just a few inches, but she knew she had shut it before going to bed. A wave of nausea rolled over her. She didn't want to move, didn't want to breathe, but she had to see. Reaching out, she grasped the closet handle and pulled it open in one swift motion. Nothing, just clothes, old boxes, the familiar scent of mothballs and fabric softener. And then she looked down. In the carpet, just beyond the threshold of the closet, were footprints, not hers. Bare footprints leading out of the closet. Anna didn't sleep for the rest of the night. The next morning, she told her parents, but they brushed it off as a nightmare. She wanted to believe them. She wanted to forget. But later that afternoon, while cleaning up her room, she noticed something she hadn't before. The mirror above her dresser, it had been moved, tilted, and in the dust on the glass, as if someone had breathed onto it, were 3 words. "Let me in." For our second story, we take you to Devon, England. September 14th, 2015. Olivia had always loved the countryside. Its quiet, its beauty, its solitude. But on this night, that solitude would become something far more unsettling. Growing up in London, she was used to the noise, the lights, the constant movement of the city. But when she got the chance to move to Devon for a new job, she jumped at it. A slower pace, fresh air, rolling hills, it felt like the perfect escape. The house she rented was small but charming, nestled just at the edge of a vast open field that stretched into the horizon. Her nearest neighbour was half a mile away, and at night the only sounds were the wind and the distant call of owls. It was peaceful, at least that's what she thought at first. The first few weeks were uneventful. She spent her evenings reading by the fireplace, sipping tea, enjoying the solitude. But then she started noticing something. Every night, just after sunset, she would see a figure standing in the middle of the field. A child. At first, she thought it was one of the neighbour's kids playing outside after dark, though she couldn't understand why they'd be alone in an empty field. The boy always stood in the same place, facing her house, unmoving. His posture was rigid, almost unnatural, but the moment she stepped outside, he was gone. She would blink, and the field would be empty. She told herself it was just a trick of the light, maybe the way the tall grass swayed in the wind. But as the days passed, the sightings continued, and each night he was a little closer. It wasn't until the fifth night that she finally saw him clearly. The moon was bright, casting pale light over the field, illuminating every blade of grass. This time the boy was standing only 20 feet from her garden fence, her stomach twisted. He was young, maybe 7 or 8, dressed in old-fashioned clothes, dark trousers, a white shirt, suspenders. His skin was pale, too pale, almost grey in the moonlight. His hair was dark and matted, as if he had been out in the rain for hours. But it was his face that sent a chill down her spine. His eyes were wrong, too large, too dark, like bottomless pits swallowing the light. He didn't blink, didn't move, just stared. Olivia backed away from the window, her pulse hammering in her ears. She grabbed her phone, hesitating for a moment before dialing the number of her neighbour, Mr. Harris, an old farmer who had lived in the area his whole life. When he picked up, she hesitated before asking, as casually as she could, if he had ever seen a boy wandering the fields at night. The silence on the other end was heavy. Then his voice low and firm. "Mr. Harris, lock your doors, don't go outside, don't look for him." A cold wave of fear washed over her. She wanted to press for answers, to ask who the boy was, but something in the old man's tone made her stop. She did as he said. She locked every door, shut every curtain, and curled up on the couch, trying to convince herself it was nothing, just a strange child, just her imagination. She barely slept that night. The next morning she forced herself to step outside. The air was crisp, the sky clear, but something felt off. The grass where the boy had stood was flattened, as if someone had been standing there for hours, but there were no footprints, nothing. That afternoon, Olivia drove into town and found herself in the local library, digging through old records, old newspapers, and that's when she found it. The story. Over 100 years ago, a boy had gone missing in that same field. His name was William Thatcher, a farmer's son. He had been playing outside one evening when his mother heard him scream. By the time she got outside, he was gone, vanished without a trace. They searched for weeks, but his body was never found. The only thing they did find was his little shoe sitting alone in the middle of the field. Locals believed he had drowned in the marshlands that once covered the area, his body swallowed by the earth. But some whispered a different story, that he had been taken, that something in the field had called to him. That night, Olivia stayed awake, her heart pounding at every sound outside. Midnight came and went, no movement, no boy. Maybe he was finally gone, maybe she had imagined it after all. Then, at exactly 3:07 a.m., she heard it. A knock, not at the front door, at her bedroom window. She turned over, her breath catching in her throat. The boy was there, standing outside the glass, his face inches from hers. His lips moved, but no sound came out. Then he lifted his hand, pressed his fingers against the window. The glass froze beneath his touch. Her scream caught in her throat. She scrambled backward, her heart racing, reaching for her phone, but by the time she looked back, he was gone. The next morning, Olivia packed her things. By noon, she was gone. She never went back, never looked back, never spoke about it to anyone except for one final conversation with Mr. Harris before she left. When she told him what had happened, he only nodded, as if he had heard it before, as if he had seen him before. Then he said something she never forgot. Mr. Harris whispered, "He always comes back." For our last story, we take you to Phoenix, Arizona, July 23rd, 2018. Ryan had been driving for nearly 10 hours, the endless desert stretching in all directions. But as exhaustion set in, so did something far more unsettling. The sun had long since set, leaving only the dim glow of his headlights illuminating the two-lane highway ahead. He wasn't supposed to be out this late, but traffic earlier in the day had delayed him, and now all he wanted was to find a cheap motel and get a few hours of sleep before continuing his trip. The neon sign flickered in the distance, half the letters burnt out, but the words "vacancy" glowed just bright enough for him to see. The Desert Star Motel wasn't the kind of place he would usually stay, but at that moment he didn't care. He pulled into the cracked parking lot, the only other car an old station wagon with no plates. The air was thick with heat, even at night, and the building itself looked abandoned. Faded paint, broken windows in some rooms, and a single buzzing light flickering above the check-in office. The woman behind the desk barely looked at him as she slid over a key. Room 12. No pleasantries, no paperwork, just a key on a worn-out leather fob. Ryan took it without question, too tired to care. The hallway leading to the room smelled like mildew, the carpet stained and peeling in places. Room 12 was at the very end. He unlocked the door, stepping into the stale, suffocating air of the tiny space. One bed, an old TV bolted to the wall, a nightstand with a lamp that flickered weakly when he turned it on. The bathroom door was slightly ajar, revealing a cracked mirror above a rust-stained sink. It wasn't much, but it was a bed. He dropped his bag by the door, locked the deadbolt, and collapsed onto the mattress, not even bothering to undress. Sleep took him almost instantly. Sometime in the night, something woke him. A sound. A soft, rhythmic creaking. His eyes snapped open, heart pounding, as he lay motionless, listening. The room was dark, but the noise was unmistakable. Something moving, rocking, breathing. He turned his head slowly toward the corner of the room. The chair, the old wooden chair near the window, it was moving, just slightly, just enough to creak against the floor. He held his breath, his body frozen in place. The chair was empty. But it wasn't. The air around it was thick, wrong. His skin prickled with the overwhelming sensation that something was sitting there, watching. He reached for his phone, fumbling to turn on the flashlight. The moment the light hit the chair, the rocking stopped. The room was silent again. His breathing was loud in the stillness, every nerve in his body screaming for him to leave. But he didn't. He convinced himself it was nothing, just exhaustion playing tricks on him. He shut off the light and rolled over, forcing his eyes shut. That was his mistake. The sheets tightened around him, the unmistakable sensation of something pulling them. His body went rigid, his breath hitched in his throat. The blankets were being lifted, slowly, carefully, like someone was peeling them away, inch by inch. He yanked them back, sitting up so fast his vision swam. The room was empty, the chair sat motionless, the bathroom door was still open, just a crack. But something was off. The air felt wrong. Then he noticed it, the closet door. It was open, just slightly, just enough for someone to be standing behind it. Ryan's stomach turned. He knew he had shut it before lying down. Every muscle in his body screamed at him to run, but he forced himself to move. He reached for the lamp, switching it on. The dim, flickering light filled the room. The closet door remained still. He swallowed hard, stepping toward it, his fingers trembling as he grabbed the edge, and then, from behind him, a breath. Not his, not human, slow, heavy, right against his ear. His body locked up. Every instinct screamed at him to not turn around, but he did. The chair was no longer empty. Something was sitting in it. It wasn't a person, it wasn't anything, just a shape. A dense shadow darker than the rest of the room. It had no features, no eyes, no mouth, but it was looking at him. He could feel it. Then it stood up. The light flickered. The room tilted. Ryan stumbled backward, his vision blurring, the air thickening around him like he was sinking underwater. The walls stretched, the ceiling pulling away as the thing moved toward him. Its presence was suffocating, pressing into his chest, filling his lungs with something cold. And then, nothing. Ryan woke up in his car. The sun was rising, his engine running, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles were white. His heart pounded as he looked around. He was parked on the side of the highway, miles away from the motel. There was no memory of getting into the car, of starting the engine, just the overwhelming sense of wrongness still clinging to his skin. He turned the car around, heading straight for the nearest town. When he stopped at a gas station, he pulled out his phone to check the time. 7:23 a.m. But the last thing he remembered was 3:42 a.m. Nearly 4 hours unaccounted for. His hands were still shaking as he Googled Desert Star Motel. It didn't exist, no records, no reviews, nothing. But in the back of his mind, something told him that if he went looking for it, if he tried to find that motel again, it would be waiting. A motel that shouldn't exist, a child who never left, something crawling through the vents whispering your name. These aren't just stories, they actually happened. And if they happened to them, maybe the next time you hear a knock at your window or wake up to the feeling of something watching you, you won't be so quick to dismiss it. Some places never forget, some things never leave, and some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. If you enjoyed these terrifying true stories, share and subscribe to The Sixth Frequency. And don't forget to hit the bell icon, because in the world of horror, the scariest stories aren't the ones you hear, they're the ones that find you. See you in the next one.